just going to start out here, and then we're going to get started. It is 4:06, and so I just want to welcome everyone. Hello, my name is Helen Hickman. I'm president of the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild for those people who are not presently members and are here as visitor to our presentation. Welcome, everyone. I just like, for those of you who are new to the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild, I just want to tell you a little bit about us. We are a nonprofit organization of professional tour guides. We have and other members of the travel and hospitality industry. And presently, most of us live and work here in the Bay Area. And we have presently about 175 members. And our mission since 1984 has been to foster a standard of quality, ethics, and professionalism among our members using things like continuing education and a certification program, which we are presently transforming. We have a code of ethics we work with, and professional standards. And we advocate for the advancement of tourism and the tour guide profession. And we act as a liaison between tour guides and employers often. And this time of COVID, we've been able to utilize GoToMeeting and do many more online presentations now. So this one being here with the fabulous Gary Kamiya. And we are guides of all types: walking tours, city walking tours, over the road, people that work in hospitality and DMCs and stuff like that. So welcome, everyone. It looks like we're getting more and more people here. I'm going to change to the presenter view. I'm going to hand it over to you, Ed, to our Vice President, Ed Franklin, and he's going to introduce our presenter.
Thank you very much, Helen. I appreciate it. Welcome all. Thank you so much for attending this afternoon. And I especially want to throw out a thank you to a bunch of people that I know at the National Park Service down at Hyde Street Pier who will be attending as well, all the docents from there. If I could here, let me just review some of the rules that or guidelines that will help us have a most effective webinar this afternoon. Please stay on mute. We appreciate that a lot. If during the presentation it doesn't bother you, feel free to shut off your video as well, although you won't be seen. But some people do leave their video on. Remember that you are on TV. We are collecting some of the most embarrassing moments to post on our website. So please keep your camera off or remember what you're doing. As we go through our presentation today, I will be monitoring the chat board. The chat is at the bottom of your, let's see, where did it go? It's up on the upper right of your screen, the little speaking balloon. If you hit that and you have a question for Gary, put it in there, and I will collect the questions and ask him the questions at the very end. So anything comes up, throw it in there. I will also be watching that for any other information you may want to pass to me. Our speaker today is Gary Kamiya, and I feel really thrilled that we have him today because he is an expert on San Francisco for a bunch of different reasons and for has a very unique perspective. Now, Gary grew up in Oakland, born in Oakland, actually grew up in Berkeley, and has lived in the city here since '71. He got his BA and MA from UC Berkeley, go. And he was instrumental in the starting of the Salon magazine, salon.com, as well as a San Francisco magazine. His first book was called Shadow Knight, The Secret War Against Hitler, and a great book. But the second one is the one that we should all know about. This one right here, let me get it in front of the camera. And it's called the cool, if I can get it without reflection, The Cool Gray City of Love. And if you are a tour guide and you haven't read this, what's wrong with you? Definitely go buy this book and read it. It is fascinating because it not only presents the past of San Francisco, but also the present. Gary gives us a very interesting perspective as a former cab driver. And I can tell you, when I was in college, I was a cab driver, so I identified greatly with all of his remarks and his comments. In fact, today he will be reading part of the book as part of his presentation. He also, by the way, writes a terrific column every other Saturday in the San Francisco Chronicle called Portals of the Past. It's also online under San Francisco sfchronicle.com called Portals of the Past, a great reference source for you, by the way. So I think that's it. That's all the introduction I want to give. I don't want to cut into his time any further. So without further ado, let me turn you over to Gary. Gary, it's yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Ed and Helen, for inviting me to speak to this organization. I'm excited because I feel like you're all my people, because one of the real motivations for writing this book was a lifetime spent wandering the streets of San Francisco on foot, on bicycle and by car, but mostly on foot. In fact, there's a myth out there that I have walked every street in San Francisco, which I have not. I actually know a woman who has just accomplished that prodigious feat. It's pretty amazing. It took her 8 years to do it. But I think I do say in the book that I've probably set foot on every 1,000 square foot square in San Francisco. So I know that, tour guides, it's all about getting up close and, seeing things from foot level and showing it to people. And that's a lot of the motivation behind this book. And that was sort of the initial existential life experience. And then as I began to write the book, the history just followed from that as a deepening and a way of enjoying it and knowing more about it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read with some, improv and some of my own comments interpolated in. Ed asked me if I would like to talk about what is maybe the most fascinating collision of two different cultures and histories of any neighborhood in San Francisco, the Western Addition and Japantown. And it's an extraordinary history. And by good luck, I have a chapter in my book that is entirely about that and is also focused on one particular building. So that's my subject. It'll probably take about 45 minutes or so, and then I'll be happy to take any questions people may have. But this is a chapter that's called The Haunted House. And the building that's the center is at 1712 Fillmore Street. Okay. A geologist would call the block of Fillmore Street between Post and Sutter a triple junction. It's one of those three-way collisions where a swanky part of town crashes into a seedy one, while a completely different quarter sideswipes both of them. In 1974, my cousin Jonathan and I were house sitting 4 blocks away at Pine and Buchanan in a majestic, decaying Victorian with a big psychedelic mandala painted in an alcove. We didn't know it at the time, but our building was a weird precursor to the Summer of Love. In 1965, that stretch of Pine Street had been a pre-hate hippie scene, with half a dozen houses filled with long hairs and dealers. The family dog, the first incarnation of it, was located there. The downstairs unit had been home to the legendary hippie newspaper, The Oracle. Across the street, at 2111 Pine, a rooming house once stood. Some of the itinerant musicians there played in a vanished after-hours jazz club 3 blocks away called Bop City. The rooming house was managed by a guy named Bill Ham, who invented psychedelic light shows. And the woman that we were house sitting for did light shows for Santana and other big rock groups. Our block was mostly black and pretty run down. We used to walk down to Kim's Market at Pine and Fillmore, now a Kiehl's, which sells $50 bottles of shampoo, to buy our daily $2 ration of sausages, carrots, and potatoes. If you turned right on Fillmore, in a block you would come to California Street, the city's great north-south dividing line. California was and is the unofficial border of Pacific Heights, the swankiest neighborhood in town. Turn left and you would quickly end up in the unswankiest neighborhood in town. Past Kim's Market, as you walk toward Bush, the block was a grab bag with a venerable Japanese restaurant rubbing shoulders with a jumping jazz and R&B joint called Minnie's Can Do Club. In the block after Bush, things started to become disheveled, a no man's land traversed by Japanese, blacks, and a few confused tourists looking for Japantown. Once you crossed the ugly multi-lane Gary Expressway, you were in the heart of Black San Francisco. Some years after I moved out of the neighborhood, I happened to find myself on Fillmore between Post and Sutter. I remember being subliminally aware that there was something odd about the east side of the street. Its feng shui was wrong. In particular, there was something weird about a row of 5 stately Victorians, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It took me a few decades, but I finally learned why that block felt off. Those 5 Victorians were not built there. They were saved from the wrecking ball, raised up from their original sites, and plunked down on Fillmore. The block felt weird because the setbacks were too deep. It is appropriate that this line of Victorians stands out, for one of its buildings has a history so rich and strange that an entire book could be written about it. The house at 1712 Fillmore is San Francisco's version of James Joyce's 7 Eccles Street in Ulysses. It is a universe on a 27.5 by 93 foot lot. In or around 1895, a 3-story Victorian was erected at 1690 Post Street, just east of Buchanan, in the Western Addition. The name Western Addition is a link with the Gold Rush days, when the city did not even include all of Nob Hill. In 1851, San Francisco's western limit was Larkin Street. A year later, the booming city extended its boundary 13 blocks west to Divisadero. The area north of Market Street, between Larkin and Divisadero, became known as the Western Addition. Now it's a vague term that denotes either a larger or sometimes a smaller area. It's not entirely agreed what the Western Addition even means now. Despite the fact that the addition is now 160 years old, the name is stuck. A more suitable name, considering the way the city has treated the neighborhood and its residents, might be the Western Subtraction. The Western Addition was a solidly middle-class and upper-middle-class neighborhood. In fact, I didn't really realize this until recently, but it was the middle-class neighborhood in San Francisco. It was where, if you were middle class, that was your choice, pretty much, was live in the Western Addition. Some lived in the Mission, but not nearly as many as in the Western Addition. It was really a streetcar suburb. It was the creation of the cable cars in 1873 and streetcar lines that allowed merchants and professionals to live there and go to their offices in downtown San Francisco. There's a great 1890 Chronicle article that talks about how in the 1880s, these 2 entirely new parts of San Francisco were created by streetcars and cable cars, the Mission and the Western Addition. They were really, until those forms of transportation spread out, those were really very desolate places. By 1900, the residents of the Western Addition were mostly native born, but 3/4 of them to immigrant parents from countries like Germany, Austria, Ireland, and France. A lot from Germany, and a significant number of them German Jews who were attracted by San Francisco's lack of overt anti-Semitism and business opportunities. By the 1870s, Jews made up 7 to 8% of the city's population, the highest of any city west of New York. The first of the neighborhood's 3 great transformations that we're going to talk about today was a result of the 1906 fire. Displaced working class people from the burned out downtown and south of Market areas poured in. The stately single-family Victorians were divided into rooms and flats. The neighborhood became more densely populated, poorer, and much more ethnically diverse. Large numbers of working class Filipinos, Mexican Americans, and poorer Jews moved in. So did the 2 ethnic groups whose fates would become entwined in the neighborhood and in that wooden building on Post Street. African Americans, and Japanese. Blacks began arriving in San Francisco before the gold rush, but never in great numbers until World War II. As Albert Broussard notes in Black San Francisco, The Struggle for Racial Equality in the West, 1900-1954, the lack of factory jobs and the distance from the South discouraged Black immigration, but so did the politely racist attitudes held by many white San Franciscans. The early city had no racial covenants for Blacks and no ghettos, but it was only the fact that there were so few Blacks that created the illusion of unusual tolerance. The white citizens of San Francisco shared many of the racial prejudices of their fellow white Americans. And of course, the most virulent racism in San Francisco was always directed against the Chinese and the Japanese, far more than Blacks. The white citizens of, after 1906, increasing numbers of Blacks moved into the Western Addition. By 1930, almost half of all the 5,000 Blacks in the city lived in the neighborhood. So did most of the Japanese. The first Japanese immigrants arrived in San Francisco in 1869, establishing the first and oldest Japantown in the United States. One of the most influential early immigrants, a devout Christian and future newspaper editor named Kyutaro Abiko, established an agricultural colony of fellow Japanese in Livingston in the Central Valley, soon followed by a colony in Cortez near Turlock. My Japanese grandparents emigrated to the Cortez colony in the early 1920s. My Nisei, my second generation born in the United States, father was born in nearby Turlock in 1925. The first Japanese in San Francisco lived in South Park, which continued to be a Japanese enclave right up to almost the building of the Bay Bridge, and on DuPont Grant in Chinatown. Like many other ethnic groups, many of them moved to the Western Addition after 1906. Then the willingness of the neighborhood's landlords, many of whom were Jewish, to rent to Japanese did not sit well with many whites. In 1907, the Chronicle ran a scare piece about the Japanese invasion of the Western Addition, titled, "A Greater San Francisco or a Lesser Nagasaki? Which?" The Western Addition was one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country. Writer Jerry Flamm, in his wonderful book, Good Life in Hard Times, calls it San Francisco's Little United Nations. The Japanese population was a mixture of older first-generation Issei immigrants, most of whom were not U.S. citizens and were not allowed to be U.S. citizens, and their second-generation Nisei children, almost all of whom were citizens. For convenience, I'll refer to them all as Japanese Americans. At some point after the quake, the majestic Victorian at 1690 Post Street was divided into apartments. Sometime before 1920, the Nippon Drug Company opened on its ground floor. In 1930, the co-owner of Nippon Drugs was a man named J. Hatsuto Yamada, who lived 8 blocks away at Bush and Divisadero. By 1940, more than 5,000 Japanese Americans were living in Japantown. There were more than 200 Japanese-owned businesses. Some owned property, the exact percentage is unclear. Many worked as domestic servants, the famous Japanese houseboys. Japantown, on the eve of the war, was a bustling enclave. It had 40 churches, 17 schools and kindergartens, a department store, and dozens of small businesses. Culturally, it was a scramble. There were 4 traditional baths, but also American-style diners serving hot dogs, ham and egg sandwiches, and fried noodles. Then came Pearl Harbor. After word got out, hostile whites drove through the neighborhood, staring creepily at its inhabitants. The authorities immediately began arresting suspicious Japanese. An incident reported in the December 9th call bulletin reveals the round up the usual suspects nature of this early venture into homeland security. Under the headline, "Enemy Aliens Arrested Here," the paper gravely reported that 3 Japanese men had been arrested on suspicion of taking a photo of an army transport, quote, although no camera was found. No camera was found could have been the motto for the entire hysterical, fear and race-driven episode that followed. Californians in general, and San Franciscans in particular, had long viewed the Japanese as even worse, more ambitious, more evil, more underhanded than the despised Chinese. Journalist and historian Carrie McWilliams described the hostility as the California-Japanese War. In 1900, the San Francisco journal Organized Labor opined, quote, "Chinatown with its reeking filth and dirt, its gambling dens and obscene slave pens, its coolie labor and bloodthirsty tongs, is a menace to the community. But the sniveling Japanese, who swarms along the streets and cringingly offers his paltry services for a suit of clothes and a front seat in our public schools, is a far greater danger to the laboring portion of society than all the opium-soaked pigtails who have ever blotted the fair name of this beautiful city." In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, expelling all persons of Japanese ancestry, including aliens and non-aliens, from West Coast military zones, which meant basically the entire West Coast. Every Japanese person in San Francisco was ordered to register and report at various sites for processing. Stripped of their belongings, except for what they could carry, they mustered at 2020 Van Ness near Pacific. My car window got broken there a few years ago, and I went in that very building. There's a car repair place there now. And then they were sent to assembly centers, namely the Tan Foran racetrack in San Bruno. Most of San Francisco's Japanese residents, including Nippon Drugs co-owner Hatsuto Yamada, were sent to the Topaz internment camp in Utah, one of 10 hastily built relocation camps, as they were euphemistically known, scattered across the barren stretches of the country. My father and his family from the Central Valley, like many from the Central Valley, were mustered at the Merced Fairgrounds, where my dad had once shown his 4-H club chickens, and after staying there for a few weeks, were imprisoned at desolate Camp Amachi, official name Granada, in Colorado. By April, Japantown was empty. Sometimes the silences left by cataclysmic events are the loudest reminders. While researching the city directories, I compared the 1942 listings compiled before the internment order from Yamada to Yamazaki with the 1943 listings. In 1942, there are 32 listings: Yamada, Yamagata, Yamaguchi, Yamamoto, Yamasake, Yamazaki. In 1943, there are none. The names and the people are simply gone. The forced removal and imprisonment of 110,000 people, most of them American citizens, for no reason other than their race, was one of the great injustices in U.S. history. But the sudden departure of 5,000 Japanese from the Western Addition proved a boon to another victimized group of Americans, blacks. As we have seen, World War II was responsible for the great influx of blacks into San Francisco. Before the war, the city had fewer than 5,000 black residents. By the end of the war, 32,000 blacks, drawn by good-paying shipyard jobs and the opportunity to get out of Texas or Louisiana. And in fact, most of the black immigrants to San Francisco came from Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma states in that area. 32,000 were living in the city. The jobs were there, but there was literally nowhere for the newcomers to live. Some found housing in the apartments that were quickly constructed in Hunters Point, but thousands more units were needed. San Francisco was not an egregiously bigoted city, but many white landlords refused to rent to blacks, and overtly racist actions were not unheard of. In this charged situation, the empty apartment buildings and houses in Japantown were a godsend because the neighborhood was already racially mixed. Its landlords were happy to rent to blacks. Between 1940 and 1950, the black population of the Western Addition went from 2,144 to 14,888. Citywide, the demographic change was even more startling. San Francisco went from having 4,846 black residents in 1940 to 43,502 in 1950, almost a tenfold increase. In one of the stranger urban transformations in American history, the area around Post and Buchanan went from being a Japanese neighborhood to a black one virtually overnight. Maya Angelou, who as a 13-year-old had moved into a building near that very corner, wrote, "The Yamamoto seafood market quietly became Sammy's shoeshine parlor and smoke shop. Yashigira's hardware metamorphosed into La Salon de Beauté, owned by Miss Clorinda Jackson. The Japanese shops, which sold products to Nisei customers, were taken over by enterprising Negro businessmen, and in less than a year became permanent homes away from home for the newly arrived Southern blacks, where the aromas of tempura, raw fish, and tea had dominated. The aroma of chitlings, greens, and ham hocks now prevailed. The old neighborhood was gone, and overnight its new inhabitants made it their own. And the neighborhood they created before the city destroyed it was one of the most jumping places on the planet. It was called the Fillmore, aka the Harlem of the West, or just the Mo. Within months, the Fillmore was exploding with life, and its crown jewels were its jazz clubs. By a coincidence as exuberant as an Art Blakey snare drum roll, the Fillmore's incarnation as a black neighborhood at the beginning of World War II exactly coincided with one of America's great artistic achievements, a rival to abstract expressionism, the birth of modern jazz in its first incarnation, bebop. The virtuoso improvisational style, created by Bird and Diz and Monk and Max Roach and Bud Powell, ushered in a new age of intense, deeply personal and harmonically advanced music. It took serious chops to play bop. To use a phrase coined by Mark Schorer, the great English professor across the bay at UC Berkeley, it was technique as discovery. And what they discovered during 1,000 jam sessions was an American soundtrack of genius and joy. For more than 15 years, the Fillmore was the hottest jazz, blues, and R&B scene outside New York. Everybody in the hood, and plenty from outside, dressed to the nines and hit the streets to drink, party, and listen. The mile-long stretch of Fillmore and its side streets were packed with more than 24 clubs. All the greats came: Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Billie Holiday, and Dexter Gordon, to name just a few. Even Art Tatum, aka God, played the Mo. In 1949, the old Victorian at 1690 Post underwent its strangest transformation yet. Shuttered up Nippon Drugs reopened as Voot City, a club run by a jazz guitarist, pianist, composer, singer, and all-around wild man named Slim Gaillard. Gaillard was a weird and wonderful character, a musical cousin of Lord Buckley. In addition to speaking 8 languages, Gaillard made up his own, which he called Voot, hence the name of his club, and he tended to add O'Rooney to the end of words. Jack Kerouac immortalized Gaillard in On the Road. He describes going to see him at, quote, a little Frisco nightclub where great eager crowds of young semi-intellectuals sat at his feet and listened to him on the guitar, piano, and bongo drums. He does and says anything that comes into his head. Shockingly, Gaillard turned out to be a terrible businessman, and Voot City quickly folded. The building's owner, Charles Sullivan, had to find a new tenant, Sullivan approached John Jimbo Edwards, one of the first black car salesmen in San Francisco, who decided to open a cafe called Jimbo's Waffle Shop in the former Voot space. When local musicians discovered it had an unused back room, they started using it for after-hours jam sessions. Jimbo changed its name to Bop City, word got around, and soon every jazz musician who came to San Francisco started heading there. The cover photograph of a charming book about the Mo's glory days, Harlem of the West, the Fillmore Jazz Era, by Elizabeth Pepin and Louis Watts, captures an indelible moment. A heartbreakingly young, innocent-looking tenor player stands on the stage. He and fellow tenor man John Handy, who I think is still alive, and trumpeter Frank Fisher are listening to altoist Pony Poindexter soloing. The young man is leaning slightly forward, his eyes half shut, a slight smile on his face. He is listening so intently, so gently, that his whole body seems to be a receptacle for sound. The young man is John Coltrane. Bop City carried the torch for 15 glorious years, but by the early 60s, musical tastes had changed. Jazz was not as popular with either whites or blacks. The club featured more R&B. In 1965, owner Charles Sullivan closed it down. Sullivan was a remarkable man. He was born in Monroe County, Alabama, to an illiterate mother. He ran away from his adoptive father at age 13 and made his way to San Francisco. When the war broke out, he was the only qualified black machinist in California. He tried to get a job at the shipyards, but the union refused to hire blacks. Sullivan got 50 white machinists to testify on his behalf, but it took the personal intervention of President Roosevelt to get the union to hire him. During the war years, he began opening bars and liquor stores that just down the street from Bop City at 1623 Post. It was the first liquor store in San Francisco to make free deliveries, a precursor of Amazon. Branching into entertainment, Sullivan became the leading black music promoter on the West Coast. The same year that Bop City closed, Sullivan played a key role in the birth of the music that would permanently relegate jazz to the high art, low audience niche. As recounted in David Talbot's Season of the Witch, Sullivan loaned his dance license for the Fillmore Auditorium to a young promoter named Bill Graham. The Airplane, The Dead, Big Brother, Zappa, and other rock bands played there in 1966 and 1967, kicking off a musical revolution as profound as the one that created jazz. Sullivan himself met an unhappy fate. In August 1966, he was found dead near 5th and Bluxom Streets, shot in the heart. The case was never solved. The ghosts of Voot City and Bop City haunt San Francisco, evoking a fabled time and neighborhood that will never return. But those legendary clubs were themselves haunted by a ghost, the ghost of Nippon Drugs, the business that had occupied the building for decades. When Hatsuto Yamada returned to San Francisco from Topaz, he opened a new drugstore 2 blocks away at 1698 Sutter. The 1945-1946 city directory shows that James H. Yamada gave up his old residence on Divisadero and moved to 1950 Bush between Laguna and Buchanan. Whether he owned the old building and sold it before being shipped off to the camp or rented it is not clear, but he never returned to 1690 Post. Yamada renamed his new store Jim's Drug Company. Oh, excuse me. He renamed his new store Jim's Drug Company after the James that he apparently began calling himself after the war. One wonders what Jim thought as he walked past his old store, now bearing the ironically similar name Jimbo's. After the war, some of the internees returned to Japantown, but many did not. As Reid Yoshio Yokoyama notes in one of the few studies of Japanese resettlement in San Francisco, many evacuees, believing ethnic enclaves exacerbated racism, thought it would be better to disperse. the major Japanese American organization, the Japanese American Citizens League, took the same position. JACL President Saburo Kido, who visited Japantown in late 1944, wrote that returning Japanese Americans would face 4 problems: housing, jobs, hostility from labor unions, and relations with blacks. Kido warned, since blacks occupy the former Japanese residential district, they will resent being replaced by returning evacuees. A confidential government report echoed Kido's fears, predicting that the release of Japanese from War Relocation Authority camps will be the cause of friction and racial clashes when the Japanese arrive back in California. Despite such concerns, about half the former residents of Japantown did return, and they found that housing was indeed a major problem. Those who had been renters found that their apartments were occupied by others. Property owners, who may have constituted as much as half of the returnees, fared better, but not always. There were 13 occasions on which their property was seized by the government. Excuse me. At first, many stayed in hostels or slept on cots, but gradually the Japanese Americans found places to live. Work was also hard to find. Anti-Japanese sentiment continued to run deep for years after the war. In 1949, the famous Japanese tea garden in Golden Gate Park was still being referred to as the Oriental Tea Garden. The Hagiwara family, who had lovingly tended it for 3 generations, was not allowed to return to it. Not until 1958 did ownership of the garden return to the Japanese community. Many businesses would not hire Japanese. Some owners said their veteran workers would kill any Japs who were hired. In late August 1945, more than 60 members of the AFL Machinists Union threatened to strike after they learned that a 37-year-old Nisei named Takeo Miyama had been placed as a mechanic with the municipal railway. Mayor Roger Lapham and State Senator Jack Shelley tried to convince the workers not to strike, but they refused to back down. Miyama was going to withdraw, but after a 3-hour meeting with JACL and War Relocation Authorities, he decided he would go to work, saying that he would be betraying other Nisei and other minority groups if he abandoned his fight for a job. Miyama showed up for work at the barn the next morning, and the machinists put down their tools. Facing 60 angry men, 2 men rose to defend Miyama. Both of them were bus drivers and part of a different AFL union. The first driver was a black man named Robert Gray. As the Pacific Citizen reported, Gray said, "When Negro bus drivers went to work for Muni, there was some fuss at first, but soon everybody got used to it. If you boys let this man go to work, you'll find it'll be the same way." The second driver was an American Indian named James Burns, who said, "Do you want the sort of thing here that goes on in the old South?" But the machinists refused to yield, saying that because Miyama had not fought in the war, they would not work with him. At this moment, the chief radio technician at the barn, Harold Stone, spoke up. Just 5 months earlier, Stone had been awarded a Silver Star for bravery when his carrier, the USS Franklin, was devastated by Japanese dive bombers on March 19th, and 807 men were killed, the most casualties on any American warship during the war except on the Arizona sunk at Pearl Harbor. Stone said, "I didn't go out to fight in the Pacific so people with differently colored skin would be discriminated against when I got home." The war hero speech made the difference. By a better than 2-to-1 margin, the machinists voted to stay on the job. By 1946, 2,500 Japanese Americans had resettled in Japantown, about half of its original population. Within 2 years, the population was back to its old size, but most of these were newcomers. San Francisco State University professor Ben Kobashigawa found that only 1/3 of the 1,952 Japanese surnames listed in the directory were pre-war names. By 1949, a lively but smaller Japantown was centered at Post and Buchanan, with 150 instead of 400 businesses. It is difficult to get a clear picture of the relationship between blacks and Japanese after the war. Research is scanty, and neither group is interested in reopening any old wounds that may still exist. After her family moved to Japantown, the young Maya Angelou was struck by the fact that the Japanese seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving not even a memory. No member of my family and none of the family friends ever mentioned the absent Japanese, she wrote. It was as if they had never owned or lived in the houses we inhabited. Keenly aware of the irony of one victimized people taking the place of another, Angelou wrote, "A person unaware of all the factors that make up oppression might have expected sympathy or even support from the Negro newcomers for the dislodged Japanese. Blacks did not feel such sympathy," Angelou believed, for all too human reasons. They were doing well, and because the Japanese weren't whites, they didn't have to fear or even consider them. Some blacks shared the negative views of the Japanese held by most of society. The NAACP took only a tepid stand against internment, but many blacks had a more favorable view. A reporter for the Afro-American newspaper, Vincent Tubbs, went to San Francisco during the evacuation. During the course of his stay, Tubbs's attitude became more sympathetic to Japanese Americans, and he noted that the black community's attitude had also changed. Tubbs came to understand that, like blacks, Japanese Americans had been victimized solely because of their race. He said that many blacks referred to Japanese Americans as their good friends. As for the returning Japanese Americans, they mostly wanted to avoid conflict and resume their lives. Some Issei, and to a lesser degree some Nisei, may have held racist attitudes, but if so, they did not express them. More likely, the returnees were simply wary of their new neighbors. In Making Home from War, Stories of Japanese American Exile and Resettlement, one aged Nisei, who was sent with his family to live in Hunter's Point, describes running away in fear when he saw a large black man on the street, and he offers a poignant apology for something that had clearly troubled him his entire life. In general, I would say the relations between the blacks and the Japanese were friendly, not chummy. 86-year-old Yokio Takakuwa, whose family returned to their home in Japantown after being interned, told me, "We tolerated each other and were decent to each other. There wasn't that much contact. Certainly the predicted clashes did not take place. When a black group, the Carver Club, put forward, 'Should the Japanese be returned to the West Coast?' as a debate topic, no one was willing to argue the negative side. There are numerous documented acts of black kindness towards the Japanese Americans. A black landlord saved Hanami Taedo's stock during Taedo's internment, allowing to reopen his art goods store. The first cleric to welcome the returnees was a black minister who invited them to join his church in San Francisco. In Oakland, black neighbors were among the first to welcome back a returning dentist and his wife. A number of black families took Japanese Americans into their homes. During the 1950s and early 1960s, San Francisco's Little United Nations experienced a renaissance. Japantown, or Nihonmachi, was now a thriving Japanese American neighborhood, adjoining a thriving black neighborhood. The two worlds collided at Post and Buchanan. Jimbo's Bop City was right next to one of the oldest Japanese businesses in the city, Uoki Sakai's fish market. Judy Yamaguchi was a Nisei girl who grew up in a subdivided Victorian flat on Post Street, right next to Bop City. Despite the crowded conditions, she described Nihonmachi as a great neighborhood for a child to grow up. Hamaguchi said that Jimbo Edwards would sometimes help her and her toddler brother cross the street to the Miyako restaurant, where her mother was a waitress. The Western Addition was far from perfect. It had crime and drugs and high unemployment, and a lot of its buildings were decrepit and overcrowded. But for all its faults, it was a living neighborhood until the city decided to fix it. The destruction of the Western Addition was the result of a perfect storm of good intentions, unconscious racism, naivete, greed, and technocratic optimism. It was San Francisco's cardinal sin, and not just San Francisco. Cities all across the country did similar things. And the city is still living with its legacy. Most accounts of the Western Addition debacle emphasize the high-level planning decisions made after the war, but the die was cast during the war. The residents of Japantown had not even been shipped off to Tanforan when city officials began worrying about what to do with their rundown neighborhood. An April 16, 1942 Chronicle editorial headlined, "Quick Action on Rehab of Jap Houses," read, "Departure of the Japanese from San Francisco presents an opportunity that will not come again to lift the face of a dreary section of the city, and at the same time creates a danger of the kind we are so prone to neglect until now. A blight now, the 20 blocks of Little Tokyo will become an outright slum if left alone. What to do? There's the rub." The paper acknowledged the city had only limited options, since the soon-to-be imprisoned Japanese owned as much as 60% of Japantown. There matters stood for a year. Then the flood of black shipyard workers into Japantown caught the attention of the authorities. In June 1943, the extreme overcrowding of the neighborhood led a city commission to investigate conditions. Its findings were alarming. In its story about the dire situation there, the Chronicle interviewed Robert Flippen, the respected black director of the just-built West Side Courts project at Bush and Baker. Those projects still exist, of course. Due to racist policies, they were the only wartime housing projects in San Francisco open to blacks. Flippen told the Chronicle, "I know of one place where 15 people live in one room, cook, eat, and sleep there. They have no toilet facilities. For that purpose, they go to a filling station or out into the street. These 15 are 4 families. They sleep in shifts. They are willing to live in anything, and a certain kind of landlord knows it." The Chronicle reported, "All participating in the effort to find a solution emphasized that it is not a racial problem, but a social and health hazard that would be the same if the district were overcrowded with whites." Japantown was indeed severely overcrowded, and city officials appear to have believed they were simply taking urgent action to clean up a health menace. But there was cultural and racial topspin. The fact that the slum area had been first a Japanese and then a black neighborhood clearly led officials to view Japantown as a kind of urban cancer that needed to be cut out. It was only the war that prevented the city from wielding its scalpel. And when the war ended, the scalpel came out. In fact, the war whetted America's appetite for wielding the scalpel. It is no coincidence that urban renewal became a national policy after the war. If America could defeat the Nazis and the Japanese, why couldn't it solve inner city blight by simply destroying the inner cities and building new ones? There may be an unconscious connection between the strategic bombing that left Berlin a heap of rubble and the urban renewal that eviscerated America's inner cities. The federal government played a critical role in the nationwide campaign to remake inner cities. The 1949 Housing Act allocated $1.5 billion for urban renewal, defined as redevelopment of blighted areas. The federal government would pay 2/3 of the costs of renewing such areas. In 1947, the city hired the respected planner Mel Scott, a former journalist, to look into redeveloping the Western Addition. Located near downtown and with a politically weak population, it was a prime location for pro-growth forces. Scott's role in what was to come was heartbreaking. He clearly meant well. He was not a racist. In his 1959 book, The San Francisco Bay Area Metropolis in Perspective, he defended the black residents who flooded into the Western Addition during the war, saying that most of them were products of a social system that resolutely kept them in their place. He was one of America's first anti-sprawl and open space advocates, and his 1961 survey triggered the movement to save the Bay, a fact that qualifies him as one of the city's heroes. But Scott's report on the Western Addition was a product of the ignorance and hubris that marked urban planning at that time, and it sent the city down a terribly wrong path. His official 74-page report asserted that rehabilitation would not work. Nothing short of a clean sweep and a new start can make of the district a genuinely good place to live. A shorter version of the report, titled New City, San Francisco Redeveloped, featured an illustration of a white couple standing on the balcony of a high-rise, looking out over the city. The text was hopeful modernist muzak. It is a green city. Broad lawns, trees, ample flowers form a setting. Excuse me, I'm turning it off. Should have turned those all off before. It is a green city. Broad lawns, trees, ample flowers form a setting for your 10-story apartment house. You look down on tree-lined walks and attractive spots for relaxation. The next page featured a ludicrously propagandistic double-page photo collage depicting the blighted old neighborhood with its death-trap intersections and alleys in which juvenile gangs plotted mischief that sometimes ended in murder. Decaying Victorians, a wrecked car, a junk-filled yard, an overflowing trash can with a liquor bottle crudely drawn on top of it, and a building with cartoon-like flames painted on it form the background against which two vaguely Filipino-looking urchins look out in mute appeal, next to a young white delinquent covering his face. With his striped double-breasted coat, jeans, and pre-Elvis pompadour, he looks like he stepped out of the pages of Graham Greene's Brighton Rock. Tactfully, no ominous black hoodlums are pictured in the report. In fact, no black people are depicted at all. But the city had no plan to include minorities in the new city of space and living green. Noting that few of the colored and foreign-born families could afford to live in the new neighborhood, Scott asked the city to ensure they would be adequately housed in future projects. The key word, and the one that revealed the limits of 1947 liberalism, was future. James Baldwin famously said, "Urban renewal is Negro removal." In his study of the Western Addition debacle, Jordan Klein, this is a master's thesis at Berkeley, and Jordan Klein actually now works for the city of San Francisco. Jordan Klein correctly argues that it is too simplistic to reduce the entire complex movement to that motive. But as he also correctly notes, in the Western Addition, urban renewal was Negro removal by design. On June 3rd, 1948, despite resistance from Black and Japanese American residents, the Board of Supervisors declared the Western Addition a blighted area and designated it for redevelopment. The San Francisco Redevelopment Agency was duly created in 1948, but for 10 years it did almost nothing. Then in 1959, a man named Justin Herman took charge. He was the man who was most responsible for urban renewal and ultimately Negro removal in San Francisco. Herman was a dynamic, politically connected leader who made things happen. The city acquired the properties in the area by eminent domain and began bulldozing them. In 1960, Geary Boulevard was demolished and work began on the enormous Geary Expressway. This third great transformation of the Western Addition turned out to be the most catastrophic of them all. Redevelopment was supposed to be a win-win-win. Corporations and real estate interests would grow, the city would increase its tax base and clean up blighted areas, and the neighborhood's residents would be compensated for their losses and relocated in better housing. If the third part did not happen, the whole endeavor would be a failure. As Herman himself wrote, "Without adequate housing for the poor, critics will rightly condemn urban renewal as a land grab for the rich and a heartless pushout for the poor and non-whites." Herman's words turned out to be prophetic. There was no adequate housing for the poor because the planning for it was fatally flawed from the beginning. Klein lists the 5 critical mistakes. First, the destruction of the housing units was not phased. Thousands of units were demolished and new housing not built for years. As a result, by the time housing was available, the community had scattered. Second, the redevelopment plans relied on invalid, overly optimistic predictions of turnover and vacancy. Third, the income of the displaced people was overstated. Fourth, the planning ignored segregation and racial covenants. And fifth, it relied on SROs, single room occupancy hotels, as replacement housing, but no one wanted to live in SROs. Facing the destruction of their community, the residents of the Western Addition organized. In 1967, a coalition of progressive ministers and community leaders, including Black leaders like Hannibal Williams and Japanese American ones like Yori Wada, formed the Western Addition Community Organization, WACO, to try to save their neighborhood. Many of them were inspired by the radical tactics of Saul Alinsky. They picketed the SFRA, organized and blocked bulldozers. Waco won some legal battles, managed to delay redevelopment, and got additional housing built, but it was too late. The battle was lost. By the time the bulldozers fell silent, 883 businesses had been closed, 20,000 to 30,000 residents displaced, and 2,500 Victorian houses demolished. Most of the displaced people left the neighborhood for good. The old racially mixed neighborhood around Japantown was trashed. The Gary Expressway, which was designed in part to carry commuters to department stores on Masonic like Sears that no longer exist, was not only an ugly gash, it became a Berlin Wall separating Blacks and Japanese Americans. Then the corporate Japanese center gutted Japantown. With the exception of old people, few Japanese Americans live in Japantown now. What happened to Fillmore Street was worse. The heart and soul of Black San Francisco was torn out. The loss only exacerbated a crisis fueled by unemployment. The demise of the shipyards and the disappearance of construction jobs forced Blacks to look for work in tourism and service, where all too often they faced discrimination. It's the same old loaded dice for a Negro in San Francisco, said a Fillmore resident. They just sugar them up a little. As for the big housing projects built in the 1960s, most of which have now been demolished, they proved to be far more efficient petri dishes for growing crime and social pathologies than the crumbling old Victorians they replaced. Minnie's Can-Do Club, the last of the great Fillmore clubs, died in 1974. Much of the Fillmore stood empty until the 1980s. Only one of the original businesses on Fillmore remains, the new Chicago barber shop at O'Farrell. Its proprietor, Reggie Pettis, coined the phrase, Filmo no mo. The phrase could apply to both a neighborhood and a community. There are fewer and fewer Blacks in San Francisco. Late one summer night in 2011, I walked the entire length of Fillmore from Geary to Haight. I saw only one Black person. I've done that walk again much more recently and may saw a few more, but there are not many. Trying to make amends for the past, in 1995, the city created the historic Fillmore Jazz Preservation District in the heart of the old Fillmore. In a well-meaning attempt to revitalize the area, the city poured $15 million into loans to launch 4 jazz-themed restaurants and clubs, including a swanky San Francisco branch of the great Oakland jazz club Yoshi's. But it hasn't worked. All 4 businesses have had to repeatedly go back to the city for more money. They're too expensive for the Black residents of the area, and not enough non-residents are coming in. The peculiar sterile vibe of this stretch of Fillmore, with its high rises and empty public spaces, a legacy of redevelopment, doesn't help. But the real reason the Jazz District is a failure is simple. Jazz isn't popular. Yoshi's was losing so much money it had to start booking non-jazz acts. The whole enterprise reeks of artificiality and museum culture and guilt. And of course, Yoshi's went out of business, and most of the other subsequent businesses also went out of business. As the Victorians crashed to the ground across the Western Addition, architectural preservationists and historians began cataloging them. A number of the most significant buildings were saved, but most were destroyed. In the late 1970s, the Victorian at 1690 Post, the building with which we started our story, was slated to be razed as part of the Japantown renovation. But in another attempt at rectification, the redevelopment agency decided to make it part of a city-subsidized retail development called Victorian Village. I may be the only person to know about Victorian Village. I found some files in the redevelopment agency's archives when it was closed, and they're just in boxes that no one's ever seen. Along with 5 other buildings, it was moved 2 blocks to where it now stands at 1712 Fillmore. There can be no happy ending to the tragedy of the Western Addition, but when I wrote this book in 2013, or it's published in 2013, I wrote it a little before, there was one for the haunted house. The building that once housed Nippon Drugs and Jimbo's Bop City is now home, I wrote then, to Marcus Books, the oldest African-American bookstore in the United States. I walked in there one fall day. The proprietor, Karen Johnson, was sitting behind the counter. She was a distinguished-looking Black woman with a short gray afro and the sardonic, dry wit of a book person. I asked her about the building's history and what she knew about Bop City. My parents started the store in the 1960s, she told me in a soft voice that was at once steely and wry. Dr. Julian and Ray Richardson. Ray Richardson was the head of the Black Studies Department at SF State. It was 1 block up from here in Fillmore. My dad was a friend of Jimbo's. He used to go hear music there. We talked briefly about the redevelopment fiasco. Johnson's contempt was glacial. The store was in various locations during redevelopment, she said. It was at Fillmore and Turk. Then we moved to Leavenworth and Golden Gate. There was a community groundswell to bring our store back to the neighborhood. Our family bought this building after it was moved. It had stood empty for 7 years. They butchered it when they moved it. They messed up the plumbing, stole all the Victorian details, the fireplaces. We've been here since 1981. We're the only Black business that returned to the Fillmore. And sadly, about 5 years ago, that bookstore also went out of business and is no longer there. I asked Johnson where the famous back room that hosted the After Hours Club was. She walked around to a table of books that stood in the center of the long, narrow room. All of this was the back room, she said. The restaurant in front was an add-on. She picked up a copy of Harlem of the West, the book with the amazing photograph of John Coltrane on the cover. This picture was taken right there, she said. Isn't that the coolest thing ever? We stood there for a moment, seeing the ghosts. I said goodbye to Johnson and walked out onto the street. It was still a scattershot scene. A Burger King and a senior housing place stood across the road. A handsome Indian restaurant stood catty corner from a Goodwill store. I turned back and looked at the old purple building. It had been through most of San Francisco's history. The light-hearted 1890s, the great earthquake and fire, the little United Nations days when kids of all colors went to the same schools and lived on the same street, the decades when it was the Nippon drugstore, run by a well-dressed man named Hatsuto, later James Yamada, the Voot City interlude Oruni, the 15 years when it was Jimbo's Bop City, a legendary jazz club run by a Black man who used to walk a little Japanese-American girl across the street to find her mother. The years when everything around it was torn down. The day it was jacked up and moved. The years it stood empty. And the 32 years it was a bookstore owned by a family who remember what needs to be remembered. I walked over to Geary. People hurried down the sidewalk. The traffic roared underneath. Like a great river, the city flowed indifferently on. And there you have it. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions anyone may have. Sorry if it went on a bit long, but hopefully not too long. So I guess you'll have to unmute yourselves or something. All right.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Ed. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. That was great. And we really appreciate your taking the time to share that with us. I have a question while we wait for the audience to send some in. I've often wondered about the Japan Center itself, the buildings. Now, I'm imagining it went up in the 60s, but what was the reaction? Was it a good idea, a bad idea? What did people think at the time?
You know, I don't know a lot. I went there with my dad, and I remember seeing like a shiny new 1967 Toyota when no one had ever heard of it. And I think my father actually got that Toyota. So there was not from that place, but it was very corporate, very clean. I think that it was, I don't know that it was particularly controversial among the Japanese American community because they had already kind of dispersed a lot by then. I don't know how many, I mean, the thing that I don't really know is how many Japanese Americans who were living there were actually displaced by the creation of that big corporate center. My suspicion is not so many. And therefore, I think it was just seen as, oh, maybe it's, you know, good for business. And of course, it does, you know, like all of these sort of corporate places, it you know, it sort of grew into itself, and it has its own charm. It's not just, you know, it has, you know, all the hardware store and, you know, all the wonderful restaurants on those bridges, and you can get a okonomiyaki, and, you know, it's not without its sort of organic quality now, despite the fact that it was implanted rather crudely in this, you know, big, you know, just very top-down way. So the short answer is, I don't really know the answer to your question.
You know, there was some talk recently about a further redevelopment, but I think it's all been put off because of COVID. John, do you have a question? I just saw your picture there. No.
What?
Did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to compliment Gary. I think you're one of the best combinations of a historian and an interpreter that I've come across.
Oh, wow. Well, that means a lot coming from you, John. I really enjoyed your book on Sutro baths, and, you know, it's thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. In fact, you often get a question: what's a good starter history book about San Francisco? And Cool Gray City of Love, I think, is one of the most readable histories. I think I see a lot of nodding heads. So thank you for what you've done, Gary.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Can I ask another one, Gary?
Of course.
One of the things I recently was reading about was the location of the Jim Jones Temple, which is also right there in the middle of Japantown, right on Geary. Today, I think it's the post office. But can you at all talk about the rise of Jim Jones and why that ended up being where it was?
Oh, why he located there?
Yeah.
You know, I'm trying to think if David Talbot describes why he chose that spot in Season of the Witch, because he's got a lot about Jim Jones in Season of the Witch. Certainly, it seems like, again, I don't know the actual answer to why Jim Jones chose that. It would sort of make sense because Jones, you know, people forget, Jim Jones was the cat's meow in San Francisco when he came in. He was like the greatest thing anyone had ever seen. He was like basically like liberation theology, but reaching out to African American and disenfranchised and minority communities. And he had all of City Hall in his pocket. And as David rather nastily and brilliantly explains in Season of the Witch, he had the goods on Moscone. You know, Moscone had some peccadillos of a personal nature that Jim Jones leveraged heavily against Moscone, and so he was very, very conniving. But no one realized this guy was going to go psycho and become one of the worst mass murderers in American history. You know, he was just seen as a progressive guy, and so my assumption would be that that site right at Geary and Steiner, I guess it is, or maybe it's Geary and Fillmore, was you know, a perfect place right in this kind of nexus of different cultures and races, right on the border between the new Japantown and the Western Addition. You know, it's right next to the black part of San Francisco. So that it would make sense for Jones to choose that. And, you know, he probably got a really, you know, good deal on it too. But I don't know the actual story of even of where he may have had his church. I don't know if that was the very first location of his church or not. So, but I would guess he chose it because it made sense for what he was doing. And of course, it's just, you know, the story then becomes this unbelievable nightmare. But it was not seen that way at the time. You know, people, everyone, including journalists, were, you know, basically initially at least, really drank the, I don't want to say drank the Kool-Aid.
The Kool-Aid.
Most inappropriate use of that ever.
Yeah, in fact, I believe Jim Jones ended up on some housing commission for the city government as well.
Yeah, I don't recall, but he was very connected, you know, and I think David talks, I think he had like connections into the DA's office. He knew what was going on before it was even happening. He was a very savvy guy until he went completely insane. And some of that he started to do this faith healing stuff where he'd palm like a chicken liver, like I'm removing your sickness. At that point, I think people started to go, you might be, you know, and he started getting more and more megalomaniacal. I once saw a performance artist named Michael Pepe who had gotten his hands on a tape recorded in Jonestown that Jim Jones made. And it's the scariest thing you've ever heard. He's just talking. He's gone totally mad and he's laughing. He's like, oh, I hear these reports that some of you want to leave. You want to leave Jonestown. Oh, you do? Yeah, well, you'll leave all right, but it won't be in an airplane. And it's completely horrifying. And this is this masterful artist who imitated all of his diction perfectly. And it's, you know, some of those tapes were actually smuggled out. You know, they exist. So it was really scary.
Let me ask you another question here that just came in here. On redevelopment, what extent, if any, do you think the redevelopment policies enacted during the 50s in San Francisco were informed by what Robert Moses was doing in New York City? Specifically, Moses' belief that people would and should live in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And the future of cities lay in accommodating automobiles.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that Moses was so influential in city planning, the high rises, you know, didn't have any qualms about just blowing through organic, old, quote unquote, blighted neighborhoods. That I'm sure that Moses's example, you know, influenced a lot of what happened all across the country. One of the things I didn't even realize fully when I wrote this book was that you can go to almost any city, big city in the country, and exactly the same things going on. It happened in Los Angeles. It happened in, you know, Cleveland. It happened this, you know, the wrecking ball and, you know, poorly planned transition of housing. This was just like a universal thing. And to be honest, I mean, some of it actually was a complete lack. This was a new territory for American planners. Like at this point, we didn't have a quote unquote underclass. You know, that had not come into existence. We had slums that were written about in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, but the much more specific problems that occurred in inner cities with the destruction of these old neighborhoods was not anything that anyone had any experience with. So that certainly doesn't excuse what they did, but it does allow you to, you have to factor that into your interpretation of these actions, because they were in the dark in a certain way when in what they're doing in the information they had. But it was why even saying that, there was, as I point out in the piece, and as Jordan Klein talks about in his master's thesis, there was clearly racist assumptions and a lack of concern for what was going to happen to the people that were displaced. They were definitely not treated as if their welfare and what was going to happen to them was of the paramount importance. And of course, one of the things that's a pretty awful is that there was a real sense in large parts of not just San Francisco, but any American cities, that all these Black people that came in to work in the shipyards and war industries in World War II, there was a kind of feeling like, oh, okay, the war's done, you can go now, you can go home. And then they were like, no, this is our home now. We're not going back to be essentially sharecroppers in Arkansas, you know. So it was a real train wreck.
In fact, I had read, I don't know if this is, I'm assuming this is true, that, you know, the so-called blight, right? They had to remove the blight. A lot of the blight was caused by the white landlords that owned the Victorians that overpacked people into the houses. There was a shortage of housing during World War II. They put too many of them in, and there wasn't, you know, adequate, you know, space for everybody. And that sort of tore it down a little bit or made it look bad.
Sure, of course. I mean, yeah, most of many of the owners of these buildings were white, and they were very, very crowded, and they got relatively low rents. It's not dissimilar in some ways to Chinatown today, where you also have extremely dilapidated housing stock. But the upside, as actually is still the case in Chinatown, is that you have pretty impoverished people that actually can live in, they're very dilapidated conditions, but they're paying $500 a month rent.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a trade-off, and the city, and every situation is different, but the city has decided they're not going to crack down in Chinatown. And if they did crack down in Chinatown, they would end up displacing. There's no way. I mean, to build a single unit now costs $700,000 to $800,000. That's not going to pencil out to $500 a month. So it's so that's Chinatown's kind of an example. And it's a different culture. It's a different situation. But that's an example of where you can have a real blighted area, but it functions. And
right.
So that has to be borne in mind. Of course, and the Western Addition was not the only blighted area. The really weird one was Diamond Heights. Diamond Heights was also redeveloped. So that was another blighted area. That was
That's why all those buildings are new up there. That's why all those buildings. I said that's why all those buildings are new up there.
Yeah, well, not the really swanky ones that are on the contoured streets in Glen Canyon itself, but the ones that are like up, sort of they're actually not bad for projects, but they definitely look kind of cheaper. They're ones that are up closer to the top of the hill.
Right. So, you brought up shipyards a couple times. Did most of the people living in the Western Addition work at Hunters Point or the other Kaiser shipyards in the Bay Area?
Many worked at Hunters Point. Many worked at Marinship. There was a huge bus service carrying African Americans, but whites and other Mexican Americans to Marinship. I don't think so many worked in the Richmond shipyards, which were, of course, the largest of all. But again, I'm not an expert in that. A significant number may have worked in Richmond. I would, if I had to guess, I would say most worked at Hunters Point, and then then after that probably Marinship, and then maybe Richmond third, and then there were other shipyards besides those big three as well. But yeah, the vast majority of the workers, of the African American workers that came to San Francisco worked in the shipyards.
Okay. Can I ask you a question about your book?
Yes.
The school. Now, when you wrote that, how did you determine what order you were going to put the chapters in?
Oh, that's a good.
I love the book very, very easily. But
I love
there must be a reason.
That was like the most fun thing. I had a big piece of art paper that I divided into 49 grids, and basically I had a lot of the ideas of how the order was going to go from the beginning, and a lot of it was kind of a little bit, it was a combination of sort of being cinematic, like wanting to do really dramatic cuts from one to the next, but then I also wanted to do this kind of tricky balancing act where it would be spatially dramatic, but I could also essentially mostly tell a chronological history, which the book mostly does. I'm able to sort of get the early geological history early on, the Indians, and the very earliest Indians. I talk about, there's a chapter on something I call the Alcatraz Triangle, these giant rocks at the bottom of the bay.
Right.
But so there's a chronological element, but then, I mean, the thing that really was the most close to my heart and what I wanted to do was I always knew that I wanted to open with the Farallones, just because the Farallones are the most sort of hallucinatory, part of, it's amazing that they're part of the city of San Francisco.
Yes.
And I say in the book, there's probably the wildest, part of any city in the world. that the city owns the place where great white sharks are fighting orcas. And then I really knew that I wanted to go the very next chapter after the Farallones, I wanted to be the Tenderloin. And that was the big positive and negative charge, was to go from there. And then it was kind of a combination, as I say, of trying to choose chapters that would allow me to talk chronologically, but also that would just have some nice variety, and that would, take you to really different contrasts as it went along. So that was one of the most fun things, because it was a little bit like sort of moving little pieces around on the board, and I played around with them, and they changed pretty close to the deadline when it was due. I was still moving them around a little bit and finding better order for them.
That's great. Glad to hear that even as a writer, you're up against deadlines. I'm glad that. Hey, let me finish up with this one here. We'll get to the bottom of the hour just right here. And that is that we have a question that came in and said, gee, as a historian, which you are, what's your view on today's San Francisco, contemporary San Francisco? The techies, the money, the homeless, hey, COVID, right?
I would say, just on the question of me being a historian, I do now feel like I'm a San Francisco historian, because I've been doing this long enough and burrowing deep enough. I'm not an academic historian. I don't have a degree in history, but I feel like I've burrowed enough into San Francisco. At least I can call myself a San Francisco historian. But in terms of San Francisco today, hey, you know what? I mean, I was always kind of a Menshevik on the tech thing. I mean, I have friends like my good friend David Talbot, who I co-founded Salon with, and he's like a lot of old, San Franciscans that really love, as I do, and respect the transgressive, maverick, progressive, wild tradition of San Francisco. And he's not thrilled with this sort of massive incursion of global capital and highly paid workers, and some of and the displacement and the cultural changes that have followed that. I'm a little bit less kind of a hard edge on that. A lot of it bothers me, but I'm also, to some degree, I don't want to bring myself down by being angry or embittered by something that probably is going to change. And actually, which takes me to part two of this answer, is that, boy, we're seeing with COVID now, and with a lot of these big companies are not reopening their office buildings, and may not do so for until they're saying next summer or longer. And the rents are now dropped 30%. I mean, so they haven't yet. It's not cheap here yet, but it's not quite as crazy. And it's even conceivable that this might end up being a little bit more of a boho city, like it just, I mean, and I think the degree to which it was bohemian and affordable is exaggerated by people. Like, I've been here since '71, and sure, you could get apartments for $250 a month then, but you were making $400 a month or whatever, I mean, it wasn't like people were making $100,000 a year. So, it wasn't, it was never like you could just completely, get away with rent murder here, unless you got a great deal, just like today. So I think there's, I would love it if it was more diverse, if it was more culturally diverse. I don't like the monoculture. There was a massive incursion of people, and I'm not putting them down. Everybody, the gold rush people wanted to get rich, like people came here because they wanted to make money. Well, who among us does not want to make money? Most people want to make money in some fashion. The opportunity was there. It did, however, mean you got this, it became monocultural, and it became more like you're getting like, frat boys and girls. It's like, God bless frat boys and girls, but I don't want an entire city made up of them. And, the tech bros, I mean, when I say frat, it's kind of a shorthand for a certain kind of, just, it's young, they're young people braying at the moon. And, it's like, it is what it is. But I think that particular demographic is, we've already seen a whole bunch of it emptying out. A lot of people that didn't have any commitment to the city have left. And then even people that, that really were the social and the restaurants and the bars, if that's what's drawing you here, then why would you stay? I think San Francisco is a little different from New York in that way, because it's so beautiful. For me, even if the bar and restaurant and all the art scene went away, I wouldn't be miserable, because you can walk out your door and it's spectacular. But when in New York, if there's no culture and there's no restaurants, like, why are you in New York? I mean, you can look up at the big buildings, but they're empty. So I think that San Francisco is, it's going to be interesting to see, but I'm very worried. The downside of this COVID thing, of course, is that all these wonderful legacy businesses, most of them a lot of them have been able to hold on, but we haven't seen the other shoe drop yet. The Paycheck Protection Plan is running out. The Trump and the Republicans have still not come up with a stimulus package. And people are hanging on by their fingers. And a lot of these great old places, not everywhere in the City Lights. City Lights did a GoFundMe. They raised $600,000 in like 2 days. But Cafe Trieste and Specs and Vesuvio and these other places that are essential to the city, they could raise 15 or 20 grand. And, I don't know how long these kind of, essential places can survive. So that's very worrisome. So there's good and bad about this whole COVID thing, for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, as I wrap up here, I'd also like to mention that, I moved here in '78 to be part of the high-tech industry. So it's really been around for 40 years,
Oh, no, exactly. People,
so it's not new.
No, exactly. Yeah,
So,
I think you would agree, though, it's sort of an order of magnitude bigger now than 78.
Oh, well, yeah, you bet, absolutely. So listen, on that note, thank you again very much, Gary, for your insight this afternoon. The book again is Cool Gray City of Love.
Let me do a quick plug for this one, too.
Oh, we got a new one. Plug it quick.
My new book, which is coming. This is called Spirits of San Francisco, Voyages Through the Unknown City. And this is with this wonderful artist, Paul Madonna, who did All Over Coffee. So he did 16 drawings.
Oh, really?
And I wrote chapters for those. So anyway, it's out next week. So if you it has even more granular information on individual sites. So it's real geeky.
That's great. Well, thank you so very much. Since you mentioned Trump, we will abandon ourselves here and all go watch the debate. Oh, wait, there's no debate. But thank you all for coming. Unless I hear from Helen or Roberto, I think we're done for today. And thank you again so very much. I hope you all appreciated it. Thank you for coming. It was a great afternoon, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Gary. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Gary Kamiya.